This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and it's Saturday, and that means it's time for another edition of Nizzanotes, my weekly vlog series where I talk about limited magic. In today's video, now that we're pretty deep into Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, I wanted to give you my rankings for the various archetypes in the format. So I'm going to look at each color pair, I'm going to show you the signpost uncommon and a key common for the deck, and talk about, why this deck is good or why it might be less good than the others. Up front, I do want to say that this format has 10 color pairs that are all very playable. There are, and there always are in every format, a best deck and a worst deck. But the difference between them isn't so massive in this format that you should really be avoiding playing certain color pairs for the most part. You can sometimes use knowledge of which archetype you think is the best as like a tiebreaker to help you decide what card to take. But there's not anything you need to be avoiding in this format. Another key thing is I'm going to be talking about these as two color combinations, but in reality, most two color decks in this format can very easily splash a third color, and you end up in like close to full three color decks reasonably often in the format. There's just a lot of good fixing, so keep that in mind. We are going to talk about each one, as a color pair, and I might talk a little bit about splashing and stuff, but we're mostly looking at sort of the core aspect of each color pair, even though you do end up running a third color a lot of the time. All right, so I have things divided into three tiers. Tier 1, obviously, are the best archetypes. These are the ones that are fairly easy to make come together, no matter, there's lots of good commons and uncommons for them. It doesn't take a lot of work to make them do their thing, and they're also quite powerful on average, and so that's why they're here. Let's start with Tier 1. I think at the very top, it's green-white. This is the enchantment deck. You've got Jukai Naturalist as your signpost uncommon. It's all about getting as much value as possible out of enchantments. Jukai Naturalist decreases the cost, and you have access to lots more enchantment payoffs. Lots of green and white creatures just happen to be enchantments, so ending up with a deck that's like 15 enchantments and a bunch of payoffs for enchantments, really fairly doable. It's usually a relatively aggressive deck. It does have sort of basically every deck in this format, even the more aggressive ones, has some grindy stuff it can do to win in the late game. But this one can be quite fast. For sort of the key common, I thought about a few of them, but in the end I went with Spirited Companion. Yeah, it's good in pretty much every deck, but this deck gets extra value out of it being an enchantment, and I think that definitely matters, and it's, gives you some nice value. The other card that, sort of came to mind when thinking about a key common for this deck is the sorcery. Actually, it's an instant that lets you return a creature and an enchantment from your graveyard. That's the kind of card that really makes this deck capable of doing stuff in the late game. But I do feel like Spirited Companion, a creature that you play early, is definitely more in the wheelhouse of green-white than sort of a grindier card. But either way, that's green-white. I think it's the best color pair in the format, the best archetype overall. Green also has really good access to fixing, and so that means if you open off-color bombs and stuff, you can play them. The second best one I have is black-green. This one's interesting. So, synergy is a big deal in this format, but I do think there are two archetypes in this first tier that aren't sort of good stuff decks. They both have an enchantment theme or sub-theme going on. Black-green certainly does. Gloom Shrieker is your signpost uncommon. It's an enchantment creature. And yeah, but it's not really an enchantment deck, and it's not really a graveyard deck. It's kind of just like a value grindy sort of deck. The key common I have here is Geothermal Kami. This card is really emblematic of what this deck is about as the key common. It's about, getting sweet value out of things, and in this case, enchantments. So you see the enchantment sub-theme here, and Geothermal Kami plus Gloom Shrieker is disgusting. You can also combine the Kami with Twisted Embrace, which is insane. There's a bunch of commons and uncommons that you can just do stupid stuff with the Kami in this color pair, and Geothermal Kami is really sweet here. But yeah, you also like that card in this deck that lets you return an enchantment and a creature from your graveyard. In fact, it's probably a little better here because this deck likes the game to go longer. There's just a lot of sweet things you can do to get 2-for-1s and to grind out value, usually enchantment-related things, but I wouldn't go so far as to call this an enchantment deck either. It Can be, but it's not always. Once again, having access to green also means you can splash off-color stuff, which is really powerful. The next one in Tier 1, and which I think is the third best archetype right now, is Black-Red, which is an artifact deck. So we've seen a couple of enchantment-y decks. Now we're seeing an artifact deck, and this one's about sacrificing artifacts. And in this deck, you want to jam as many artifacts into your deck as you can. And sort of like green-white, it's just like, hey, look, all my creatures happen to be artifacts or enchantments. In Black-Red, a lot of your creatures just happen to be artifacts. So you don't really have to try that hard to get Oni called Anvil going. But, there are some sweet things you can do. I think the key common for this deck is Virus Beetle. This little artifact comes down early, makes your opponent discard something. And then you can sacrifice it to something like the Anvil for value. You can do all sorts of things with it, thanks to the fact that it's an artifact. You can sacrifice it to Sokenzin's Smelter, which is a really good uncommon in this deck. And yeah, this deck, it is usually aggressive. You have access to a lot of good low drop creatures. You have access, another card I considered putting as the key card here is the Boar that can be channeled as a combat trick, because that thing is awesome in this deck. You usually only run like 16, 15 even lands in this deck, but the Boar is fine because it's such a good trick, and if you can slam it late, it often just gets you there. But yeah, this deck is mostly aggressive, but as you can see from the Anvil, it can also play a long game, like a lot of decks in this format can. It gives you a lot of extra damage in the late game. The fact that you can just be giving up your artifacts for value and stuff. So Black-Red, it's about sacrificing stuff. It's mostly an aggro deck. You sacrifice stuff to do damage and things, or make a new creature and stuff like that, more than you do anything else. So that's Black-Red. And then the last one in this first tier is Blue-Green. Sort of like Black-Green, I already sort of referenced this. Blue-Green is kind of a good stuff deck, but with an enchantment sub-theme. Here, your signpost uncommon is that Skyturtle, who's awesome. Channel is sort of the sub-theme that the Skyturtle's pushing you towards. It's also an enchantment creature, though, which obviously pushes you in a certain direction. Channel is a big theme in this deck, as is, again, recurring enchantments from your graveyard. And I think, for me, the signpost uncommon here is Greater Tanuki. This is the deck that really does the best job of playing multiple colors. This is a great base for you to be playing multiple colors, because you have access to things like nice card draw. You have access to good, spells. You can channel Skyturtle to buy yourself time. And you have the Tanuki, who can ramp and fix for you, and then also just be a big beater when that's what you need. Again, I keep saying it about all these green enchantment decks. The card that lets you return an enchantment and an enchantment and a creature, from your graveyard is good, and it's probably the most insane here because you can combo it with the Skyturtle to do all kinds of wacky things. It creates a loop basically where you end up netting a card every single time if you're channeling Skyturtle to get it back. And sometimes you don't have time to do that, but when you do, it's a good time. So that's the first tier. Mostly you can just end up in these color pairs, and if they're reasonably open, you just draft the stuff that comes your way, and you end up with a pretty good deck. There's definitely some synergy to be had, and a lot of it kind of just falls into your lap, and that's kind of what makes them so good. You don't have to end up with a bunch of different key cards for the deck to function. They're all pretty good most of the time when you draft them. Let's move now to Tier 2. This is obviously worse than Tier 1. These are decks that might take a little bit more work to come together. They might be a little less consistent, and they might be a little less powerful, but they're still pretty good. At the top of this tier, I have Black-White. This was one that I had really near the top originally, but I've kind of come down on it lately. Your signpost uncommon here is Naomi. This color pair's about getting enchantments and artifacts in play. Usually, at least one of each gives you some nice value, like Naomi. And she is really strong, one of the stronger signposts if you can get her going. Making a 2-2 when she comes down and then a 2-2 when she attacks is crazy. And your key common here is a big part of where this deck's power comes from, and that's Kami of Terrible Secrets. This thing is one of the best commons. It is basically a build around, because if you end up in a deck with 3 artifacts and 15 enchantments, you probably still play it because it'll trigger sometimes, but it won't trigger often enough. In this deck, you have lots of reasons to be mixing it up with artifacts and enchantments. You're kind of looking for 8 and 8 in this deck, and if you can do that, you end up with powerful cards like Naomi and Kami of Terrible Secrets, just giving you a 2-for-1 and a decent body, and even gaining you a life. So Black-White, it's good. It is a little harder to make come together. You do have a really good common payoff in the Kami, but for the deck to be great, you kind of need like Naomi. You know, you need Naomi or the Michiko Saga, things like that to really beef it up. But it's a pretty good deck nonetheless. After that, I have blue-black. This is the Ninja deck. This is another one I've been up and down on, and it sort of ended up in the middle for me in the end. Yeah, it's the Ninja deck. You have a Signpost Uncommon, which is your Ninja Lord. It's been kind of a disappointment, honestly. You know, it looked really good in the set review. You know, pump all your ninjas and rogues and reduce the cost of ninjutsu seemed insane. And it's good, don't get me wrong. But you don't even need this Signpost Uncommon to have a remotely good ninja deck. Like, it's not even one of the cards you're like, oh boy, I really need to get one. You'll play it, obviously, but it's not amazing. Mostly what this deck wants to do is play cheap threats that are evasive, that can set up all kinds of ninjutsu shenanigans. Network Disruptor is what I have as the key common here. This thing is such a good common. It's good in, you know, a lot of decks in the format, especially the artifact ones. But it's really good here because you can play it and tap a thing, you know, and that can allow you to get in with a ninja who has a combat damage trigger, or it can allow you to set up ninjutsu because it tapped a blocker out of the way. And then what's really sweet with it is if you play it on turn 1 and, you know, attack with it on turn 2, great chance you can ninjutsu something in, like the hacker ninja guy who draws you a card, which is insane, and then you can just replay the Disruptor again. You know, that's a sequence that is so strong that you see all the time. That's just a couple of commons. And so you want a bunch of cards that are evasive to set up your ninjutsu, and then you want to be able to get value out of ninjutsu. And this deck it's basically a tempo deck. It can be more all-in aggressive, but usually you're doing some disruptive shenanigans to really support your game plan, which involves getting down cheap creatures and doing ninjutsu stuff. So that's blue-black. Blue-red is the last one I have in Tier 2. This one is an artifact deck, and its Signpost Uncommon is Enthusiastic Mechanaut. I think it's not as good of an artifact deck as Black-Red, but it's pretty good. You know, the Mechanaut's quite strong. Reducing the cost of artifacts is good. This is a deck that can really run the gamut all over the spectrum. I mean, and I think that's true. You have, like, aggro, mid-range, and control decks in almost every color pair in this format. Maybe. I mean, like, blue-green and black-green, hard to be really aggressive with them. But for a lot of the color pairs, you can end up there. And blue-red is one that I think you see all over the place the most. You can have a really aggressive blue-red deck where you're just playing cheap artifact creatures like the Disruptor we just mentioned, and you're just getting, you know, value out of artifact payoffs that are creatures and stuff like that. But you can also end up with sort of a slower deck. In both of these decks, Experimental Synthesizer is great. This is a card that's obviously really good in black-red too. You can sack it for value. But I really like it in this deck, too. This is another deck that wants, like, 15 artifacts. And you want, you know, a relatively low curve, usually, if you're running the Synthesizer, but, and especially in the aggressive version of the deck. But, yeah, I mean, blue-red is an artifact deck that is, in most ways, I think, inferior to black-red, but not by so much you should be avoiding it. It's still in Tier 2, after all. So that's the second tier. You know, we've got black-white, blue-black, and blue-red in the second tier. Let's move now to the third tier where, you know, if you're counting, you know which ones are going to end up here. So these are the bottom three. Like I said at the beginning, all three of these are playable. I've had success with all three of these. Most people who've drafted a lot have had success with all three of these. But they do come together the least frequently. They have the lowest sort of power level on average. That doesn't mean you don't draft them. It just means, on average, they're not going to come out quite as powerful as the other color pairs are, you know. And when I say this, I'm saying, you know, assuming they're open. You know, you have to find the right lane, obviously, and that's usually the right place to be. So, Tier 3, we've got red-white at the top of Tier 3. This might be the color pair I've actually drafted the most, weirdly enough. And I don't think I've ever done worse than 5 and 3 with it. But I still don't think it's great. You know, even though I've had independent success with it, good success on my own, I acknowledge overall that this color pair has some problems. It's the samurai color pair. It's about attacking alone. You know, a sorry captain is your signpost. And that's kind of the problem with the deck, is you're kind of being pulled in multiple directions here. It's like, hey, let's be an aggro deck where we attack with all our guys. But then it's like, no, not so much. We just want to attack with one thing at a time. And, you know, you kind of end up walking a tightrope where you have to decide which way to attack on turns, whether it's better to swing with everything or with one thing. And generally, if things are going well for you, the way it usually goes is you're attacking with one thing for a few turns, and then you have an Alpha Strike that does enough damage to your opponent. And this is an aggressive deck. You have access to some nice haste creatures like the Captain. I think the key common, there's a lot of different ninjas or samurais I could have gone with. I went with the Subduer in the end. The fact that it taps down a blocker when it attacks alone really enables your samurai who are getting buffed by other effects to do some significant damage. So yeah, I mean, it's an aggro deck. It's a bit awkward. It's definitely a weird play pattern to have in an aggressive deck where you don't attack with everything a lot of the time. But it's a perfectly serviceable deck. If red-white's open, and that's part of the reason I end up in it a lot, I think a lot of people have decided, that it's not worth drafting. But if it's open enough, you still end up with a pretty good deck. And that's, if you go watch my draft videos, I probably have 6 or 7 up at this point that are good red-white decks. It's a real thing, but it has problems. Its best commons and uncommons aren't as impressive as many of the other colors. And it doesn't have as many like value engine nonsense things it's doing that all the other color pairs that we've talked about so far can do. So in the ninth deck, the ninth color pair I have is red-green. This is another aggro deck, and it's about modifications. This one's interesting because I think the signpost uncommon for red-green is super strong, like one of the best ones. But the times I've seen it be the best are usually when you splash it in some other deck. So red-green is supposed to be about modifications. It's supposed to be about curving out and doing crazy things with your creatures. But kind of like with red-white, part of the problem here is that this format is filled with like value 2-for-1s and stuff, and just being like a mindless aggro deck that just turns stuff sideways is at a real disadvantage in this format, where it's not that hard for opponents to sort of get their shields up and make the game go long. And then once that happens, you basically have no hope because your deck can't really compete. That's not to say this deck is, again, it's not unplayable. You can end up with some insane curve outs where you just play like all modified creatures. I have the key common as Heir of the Ancient Fang. You can pretty consistently get a 3-4 out of this on turn 3, and that's pretty sweet, especially if you have other modification payoffs. But yeah, overall, I mean, I think just being a pure aggro deck without the kind of, black-red is an aggro deck, right? But it has all kinds of sacrifice value things it can do. And red-green and red-white both don't really have that angle at all. They're just aggro decks, they're creature decks. And it's kind of not great to be there in this format as good as it is otherwise. Again, if it's open and you end up with all the awesome, signpost and commons and all the payoffs, you end up with a pretty good deck, of course. But its ceiling isn't nearly as high as all these other decks are, and it's also on average, not as good. But if it's what's open, it's what's open. And then the last one, the one that I think is definitely the worst, and it's a couple rungs even worse than red green. I think it's clearly the worst deck in the format, but also playable, and that is blue-white, which is supposed to be the vehicle deck. And this is a similar problem to the other two cards in this other two color pairs in this bottom tier. It is a vehicle deck, but doing vehicle things isn't that great. I mean, in a format, again, where everyone else is getting all kinds of silly value, just playing vehicles and crewing them with your pilots isn't that impressive. You have a good signpost uncommon, making it so your vehicles spit out tokens is great. It's basically like a mini Isuka's Chariot, which is cool. And I have the key common as Kitsune Ace, a creature that makes your vehicles better. But the weird thing here that really even makes it worse, I think, than the other two decks in this bottom tier is you have all these vehicle payoffs. You have all these reasons you want to play vehicles, but it gets really awkward to play more than like 3 vehicles in most decks. This is because you need a certain number of creatures who can crew them, and you can't add so many vehicles into your deck that you're missing some creatures. You don't want to cut back on spells, and so you just end up with sort of a weird tension where you're like, hey, my deck is really good with vehicles, but I can really only run like 3 of them. And that means my Prodigy's Prototype and Kitsune Ace aren't nearly as impressive. The best versions of this deck I've seen generally are less vehicle-centric, and that's kind of sad, because that kind of means it's just a good stuff deck, but without the sweet value that the other, the two that we saw in the top tier, black-green and blue-green, it doesn't have that kind of sweet value stuff going on in the end. So blue-white is the worst deck, but it is playable, certainly. But keep in mind, you might have different rankings than me. Let me know if you do in the comments. But whatever archetype it is you think is the worst in a format, keep it in mind when you're trying to decide your early picks. But if all of a sudden you're getting every great blue and white card, of course, you end up in blue-white and you end up with a pretty good deck. So that's my ranking for the archetypes. Now, as always, we will, well, not always, but as always, when talking about a specific format, we're going to jump into a crack-a-pack now. We're going to look at a pack of Neon Dynasty in a pack one, pick one scenario. I'll talk about all the cards in the pack, and I'll tell you what I would first pick. Okay, so here is our pack. We've got a Gainland first. Gainlands are good. I mean, you can take them pretty highly in this format. I don't recommend ever taking them with a first pick, but fixing's really good. I talked, just talking about the archetypes. You end up in 3-4 colors a lot, and it's not that hard to have a good mana base thanks to these Gainlands. You don't take them early. Next up, it's Aki Warpaint. This card is not good. It probably would be a little better if, aggro was better in this format, but like I was just saying that, the red-green modify deck, which might be the deck that this would have been the best for, that deck, doesn't have a lot of built-in 2-for-1s like a lot of the other color pairs. And what you're really doing when you play Aki Warpaint is you're giving your opponent a 2-for-1 in most cases. So it's really bad in this format. There's some formats where it might have been okay. This isn't one of them. I think it's basically unplayable. Uncharted Haven. This, like Gainlands, is a common fixing land that is good for you. I do like them a little better than Gainlands most of the time. And I think I would take it over Blossoming Sands. But yeah, I think... we're definitely not taking either of them with this pick, but so far we haven't seen much that's very good. We've got Return to Action next. Also not great. It's not terrible. It's definitely playable. It's not like Aki Warpaint or anything. But it's a very situational card. And the more we play limited, and then as formats have been changing, cards that just don't do stuff, like most of the time, tend to not be great in limited. And this does stuff some of the time, but that's the key. It's good at blanking a removal spell or as a combat trick, but in a lot of ways you'd rather just have another creature than Return to Action. You end up playing this as your 22nd or 23rd or 24th card or whatever, but it's nothing special. Certainly not something you first pick. Geothermal Kami. Okay, well, I was just talking about this card, how it's pretty good in green-white, it's pretty good in blue-green, it's pretty good in black-green, and those are three, very nice decks. And it does all kinds of things in all of them. I do think it's best in black-green because of the shenanigans that you have access to involving Twisted Embrace and stuff. And so, at worst, this is a 4-mana 4/3, and at best, it's a 4-mana 4/3 that gains you 3 life and gives you some serious value. And it does that way more often than you'd think. So it's certainly what I would pick here. We've got Merfolk Puzzle Maker next. This thing's fine. This is a card that I think they wanted to be like crewing vehicles, so you could scry with it like in the blue-white deck, and it can do that, I guess. But as we just discussed, that deck's not amazing, so, you just end up playing this in decks where you want like a defensive artifact creature, like blue-red, but it's fine in like blue-green and stuff like that too. Definitely Geothermal Kami is better. Like the way it's like Return to Action, although I think even worse. It has 2 modes unlike Return to Action, but both modes are so underpowered and so situational that you just don't get a card worth of value often enough to play it. Experimental Synthesizer is next. I did talk about liking this card already, especially in black-red and blue-red. It basically nets you cards. It's one of these cards. It can give you a 3-for-1 in an ideal world. So it's one of these cards that sort of does the thing this format likes. So it's pretty good. I do think I like the Kami a little more. I could see going either way, though. They're similar cards where, if you don't end up in a deck that's interested in artifacts, or you don't end up in a deck with enchantments, you're not going to play each of these. But you end up in those often enough that I think they'd be okay. I don't think I'd be thrilled about first picking either in the end, but I don't think I'd be devastated either. Undercity Scrounger is next. This thing's fine. I play one every now and again, especially in decks that care about artifacts. It's a little better in like grindier versions of the black-red deck because you can make treasure, which you can sacrifice to the anvil, and other effects, which is pretty sweet. But it ends up, like I said, most black-red decks end up being more aggressive, and it doesn't really fit there. It gives you fixing, gives you some artifact tokens, which is nice. But I would take the Kami or the Synthesizer over it. Bamboo Grove Archer, this is a nice card. It really enables both the blue-green and black-green decks to make games go long early, and it's nice that you can channel it to plummet something late. Still think I'd take the Kami or the Synthesizer over it, though. Now we're moving into uncommons, and we've got the Fall of Lord Kanda. You know, this is a saga that I've been talking about as it's definitely underperformed. Chapter 1, if you don't have a target for it, it's rough, and that happens more often than you would like. That said, I do think the first copy is excellent in white decks. I mean, it's a removal spell that gives you value. I think I'd be inclined to take it over Geothermal Kami in the Synthesizer, but it's close. Much closer than most sagas in this format would be. Like most sagas in this format, I think you'd take over the Kami or the Synthesizer. This one, it's closer. We've got Sky Blessed Samurai next. This is an enchantment payoff. It's pretty good. You know, it ends up being a huge flyer that's reasonably efficient pretty often. You know, I like it a fair bit. Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe it's what we'd take here. It is, you know, in a format where there's all these silly value things you can do, just taking a big flyer isn't as exciting as in most, but it's pretty good. It slots into the black-white deck, the green-white deck, you know, even the red-white deck to some extent if you have enough enchantments. And it is a decent finisher. So I think I'd take it, but it's not special. It's nothing special. We've got Go Shintai of Lost Wisdom here. You know, shrine decks are a real thing in this format. You know, ending up with 2 is pretty doable. And then if you have like a Shrine Steward, you know, getting both in play isn't that crazy. But this is probably the weakest of the shrines. The other ones on their own do much more impressive things than this one does. That said, it's a decent defensive creature. It can actually attack and do ninjutsu things. Don't forget it doesn't have Defender, even though it has 0 power. Its mill effect is kind of negligible, but, you know, being a flying enchantment creature in blue in this format has some value, but I think it still falls behind, like, the Samurai, the Saga, the Synthesizer, and the Kami. Next, we've got Banishing Slash, and here I think things are getting interesting. I think this is where we would move to now. It is double white, and it can only destroy tapped creatures, but there are lots of artifact and enchantment creatures in the format that it can just kill. You know, just look at this pack. How many of these creatures are artifacts or enchantments? The answer is a lot. And it can kill all of them. And then if you can get an artifact and enchantment in play, it becomes completely absurd because it's basically a 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance that destroys a thing. And that's crazy. You know, for me, it's kind of funny. I think every time I've played the Slash, I've ended up not in like a black-white deck, and I've ended up in like green-white, and I'm not that good at getting the token, which has been a bummer, but I have had it happen against me plenty, and it's very real. We do have a bomb mythic rare, though. We've got Tamio, Completed Sage. She's one of the bigger bombs in the format. Funnily enough, like Banishing Slash, I have had her once, and it didn't go well, and it wasn't really her fault. The deck wasn't that bad, but I think I went like 2 and 3, and it wasn't a great deck, and it was kind of a bummer to not do that well with her, but obviously, that's just my own anecdotal evidence. It's not that Tamio is bad. She's actually incredible. You know, her +1 locks a creature down. Her -X can get creatures back to protect her, and her ultimate usually wins you the game. And the fact that you can cast her for less, the flexibility of Completed is really awesome. So it's a pretty easy Tamio in this pack, I think, followed by the Slash, then the Samurai, then Kami / Synthesizer, then Fall of Lord Kanda, I guess. I don't know. You know, I said earlier that I'd take the Fall over them, but now that I'm thinking about it more, I'm not sure that I'm feeling it. But yeah, this is a pretty strong pack overall, though. I mean, you have lots of cards in it that are quite good, and 4 that you'd feel okay about first picking. So pretty nice pack. Definitely Tamio for us, though. So that does it for this edition of Nizzanotes. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you're not already subscribed, please do so you can stay aware of new content. If you want to catch up on past content, including a bunch of draft videos and other stuff, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can on Patreon. Thanks for watching.